Hello, my name is Richard Ali, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here on this Kabafest panel with the writer and journalist Abubakar Adam Ibrahim. Abubakar is a Nigerian writer and journalist. He has been described by German broadcaster Deutsche Welle as Northern Nigeria's literary provocateur amidst the international acclaim for his award-winning novel Season of Crimson Blossoms. Abubakar was born in Jos, North Central Nigeria, and he holds a BA degree in mass communications from the University of Jos. His debut short story collection, The Whispering Trees, was longlisted for the inaugural Etisalat Prize for Literature in 2014, with the title story being shortlisted for the Kane Prize for African Writing that same year. The collection was republished by Cassava Republic Press for the international distribution, and a French translation is coming out in 2022. In 2014, he was selected for the Africa 29 list of writers aged under 40 with potential and talent to define future trends in African literature, and he was included in the anthology that came along with that. Ibrahim has won BBC African Performance Prize and the Anna Plateau Amateur Grade Prize for Prose. He is a fellow of the Gabriel Garcia Marquez Foundation, as well as a Civitella Ranieri Fellow. Welcome, Abubakar Adam Ibrahim.
Thank you, Richard.
So perhaps the first place we should start is the issue of genre, right? When you first came into prominence in 2008, it was actually for a radio play. I remember hearing it on 90.5 FM in Jos, The Bullman Story. There was the short story collection, The Whispering Trees, which of course was shortlisted for the Kane Prize. Then there was a novel, Season of Crimson Blossoms, which won the NLNG Prize. And now you're back to short stories again. I think there's a novel which Masobe Book announced recently. Yeah. And you've done a lot of journalism. You know, you've done extensive journalism, and I have seen some sneaky poetry from you. So it would seem, Abubakar, that you're a writer who feeds the stomachs of many genres, and younger writers, of which this festival is full, are curious to know how. Basically, my question is, what decides the genre for you? More importantly, for your writing process, are there particular challenges for each of these genres?
That's a very good question, Richard. Thank you. You are right. You've seen a bit of me everywhere. I try, as they say. I try, but I know the areas in which I feel most comfortable. And what dictates what I write is what I write. It's not like I wake up today and say, oh, you know, I'm in the mood for writing poetry. If something moves me, if something inspires me, and I feel the best form of expression for that thing is poetry, then poetry is going to be. Like my poetry, for instance, is emotional. It's something that drives me from within, right? And if it's strong enough, then I put it on paper. I don't call myself a poet because of people like you, obviously. you guys make poetry so beautiful and easy and beautiful and easy in a prohibitive kind of way. People like us are like, no, let's not go to that territory. Let's leave the masters to do it. And that is perfectly fine. Yeah, I've Bash Amuneni, who is an excellent spoken word poet.
Brilliant writer.
He's a brilliant person. But with regards to the short stories, these are things that come with time. Most times I don't like sit down and say, I'm going to produce a book of short stories. The stories are written over time. And this is especially true with The Whispering Trees. This was how it came about. Stories that were written effectively over a period of, I think, 10 years. Thereabout. I think it shows in the range and the quality and type of the stories, right? Because I think there's sort of a trajectory of growth and changes in ideas and all of that. With Dreams and Assorted Nightmares, it was sort of an idea that I had of kind of making a place central to the story. For me, place is very important. It's very, very significant because it is what underpins our history, our mental makeup, and our constitution of our worldview. You know, and I think it's important that we document that. So I wanted to write something that would center place in the narrative, that would give place the role of a major character that determines the fate of people and their situations. And I think this is true of life. The place or space you occupy at any given time often determines the outcome of your life, how successful you are, how you feel, why you feel, and things like that. With regards to the novels, I've always seen myself as a novelist. Principally, that has always been my primary ambition, to write novels, right? So those things happen. Sometimes when the stories come, there are stories that are set, like Season of Crimson Blossoms, for instance, stories that want to be realist. It's not like I sit out and say, well, I want to write a story about how society is treating people. I don't just want to write stories about people who are in situations. And these situations are often shaped by their environment, by their culture, by the circumstances in which they find themselves. Other times it's leaning more to the fantastical, magical in a way. And I've always maintained that in as much as I'm more or less obsessed, but I'm deeply taken by magical realism. And I just feel like we need to stay grounded, right? Write magical realism without losing the realism, because that is super important for me.
So I'm glad that you mentioned a bit about the centrality of place. Dreams and Assorted Nightmares is a collection of about 12 short stories, if I'm not
Mm-hmm.
mistaken,
Mm-hmm.
which is set in a very familiar nowhere, the town of Zango. We're not even sure whether it's a town or a village, but it's a place called Zango. And Zango is the context of dreams and nightmares alike. It's the context of the dreams and nightmares, which is just as important. It's a background for the very
Mm-hmm.
earnest humanity of your characters. From a technical point of view, ensuring the coherence in your world building is perhaps the single greatest achievement with any book, particularly in your book. So I am interested in finding out why. How do you manage it? The town itself, the way the stories speak to each other. Did it take you 10 years to write that too? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which chicken, which egg, for example? So perhaps what I'm asking simply is, Abubakar, in your guise as a literary architect, could you walk us through Zango as you built it, the physical as well as the psychogeographical points of importance
Mm-hmm.
in this story, this magnificent interrelated set of stories that you have gifted us?
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very deep question. And it's also a very challenging, and I don't think I've been asked a question like that before.
I'm very happy to hear that. I'm very happy to hear that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the idea of Zango for me started with the people that occupy the space. And I've always said that the story is central. And the idea of these characters occupying this space was something that has been with me for a while. I mean, I don't know if you've read Miguel Street by V.S. Naipaul. It's a novel, actually. His is a novel, right? But it's done in a way that it's set on this street. Everyone in the story lives in that street. Their stories are somehow connected and not connected, but in the end, it's sort of like plays out. And I thought it was brilliant and funny and amusing. And I've always wanted to do something like that, because I find that where my stories come from, they are like super interesting spaces, right? That condition how we behave and how we interact with each other. And this idea that you live in, I mean, you and I come from Jos, right? And there's a way we relate based on the fact that even though we didn't grow up in the same area or the same district or any of that, but there's a Justin, whatever that is, right? That connects you and me. And if we had met each other for the first time somewhere else outside of Jos, there's a way we will connect based on shared codes that we have. And that was the idea that triggered Zango. Zango, it's a place I visualize. I see it in my head, starting from Bapa Avenue, right, which is like the main street of Zango, which is wide and spacious. A typical street in a small town, nothing big, nothing too grand, and not a village, contrary to the expectation. It's a trailer town. It's a park town, the sort that we have a lot of in Nigeria. And I think that is the fascinating thing, that even outside of the north of Nigeria, whoever read the story said, "Oh, it feels like this town that I know." And for me, that is like super significant. So if we start from Bapa Avenue, where you have shops and people, and up the street you find Regia's house next to the cattle market, and flanked on the other side by the mechanic workshop. If you go beyond that, up the hills, you will find Sakina's house, where she lives with her parents. And from there, you could see the entire layout of Zango, the side streets, the corner shops, the people who interact and do business on a regular basis there. You see from there the overhead bridge where Vera and her people will sit down and braid people's hair and things like that. So, it starts with that visualization of this is where all of this in place are. This is the map. This is where this character lives, and this is where they do their thing. And at some point, there's a convergence of all these characters. So, with the concept of the place in mind, the idea of the people, all of them kind of like was easy to put together. Or in some instances, the characters and the people kind of necessitated the creation of certain districts and places, right? That is in a way appropriate to their station in life. So it was really a fascinating experience. I enjoyed creating the people and the town and all of it and rendering it into the written format. It was a deeply, deeply satisfying experience for me.
Okay, thank you very much for the compliment. I like
Yeah.
asking questions that no one else has asked, so there you go.
Thank you. We appreciate your brilliance and your genius.
You cannot count on it, but I like it being appreciated. Okay, moving on very swiftly. Molara Wood, she had a very, very kind blog in the Masobe edition of Dreams and Assorted Nightmares. She's a culture critic and a very fine writer of short stories herself. Molara describes you as keeping alive the flame of the late Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And a few years ago, I think it was 2013, you were a Marquez Fellow in Colombia for your work as a culture journalist, and you actually lived in the house of the great man, as it were. So your work has been interpreted, as Molara Wood does, as being comparable to the finest South American writing, magical realism, and its derivatives, which you've actually mentioned, particularly Marquez. So what are your thoughts about Gabriel Garcia Marquez? Have you read his books? And could you speak about the ones you found most interesting?
First off, Malara Wood is a very kind and generous person. To have her say that of my work, considering her expertise and field of operation, I think it's very kind and generous of her. And I'm very appreciative of that. Secondly, I didn't live in Marquez's house. I wish I did. I wish I did. But I was effectively in the same city, in the same towns that he was, that had significance in his role as a person and as a writer. And I visited all his houses. And he wasn't in Colombia at the time. And yeah, he was in Mexico where he lived up until his death. But I had the pleasure of spending time with his brother, who was generous enough to share stories of Marquez's growth and all the naughty things they did as little boys back then in Colombia. And it's fascinating. It's super interesting to be in that space and see like the places he was born, the church he was baptized in, the telegraph shop that his father worked in, where he met his mother and then eventually they fell in love, his grandparents' house where he grew up, and to see a sample of some of the crafts that his grandparents produced, his grandmother especially, who had a significant influence on his life as a writer. And all these places have been, even while he was alive, they've been kind of canonized in a way. They've been made into museums to preserve his culture, his history, and what it means to the town. And you go to all these places, to places like Barranquilla, for example, where he lived and had fun as a young person, where he started off as a journalist, or places like Aracataca, the village in which he was born, and to see people who knew his parents and things like that. That was fascinating. In terms of his works, which one do I find the most fascinating?
Yes.
Everything Marquez writes is fascinating. Every single thing. I haven't read anything of Marquez
That you
that
didn't
isn't
like.
fascinating. Absolutely. Of course, you
Yeah.
like some more than others, and I have a friend that we've been having this running debate over which one is Marquez's finest book. Is it Love in the Time of Cholera, or is it 100 Days of Solitude? And I keep arguing that it's Love in the Time of Cholera for me, right? Because I find that like a fascinating piece of work. And there are like very few lines of dialogue. Everything else is the narration, and it's brilliant. And it's so brilliant that you probably don't notice that, oh, there are like very few lines of dialogue in this novel. And I think it's something fascinating that Marquez did with that. I've read quite a bit of Marquez's work, starting with the work that made him kind of famous back then when he was like really a no one, just a struggling journalist who at some point ended up sleeping in the park because he couldn't afford to pay rent in Barranquilla. And incidentally, I saw the park and they showed me the bench that, oh, he used to sleep on this bench in the park.
Tell me you slept on it as well.
No, I didn't. I wasn't that fanatical about it. But it was satisfying to see it and see places like the tree that the doctor in Love in the Time of Cholera fell down from and eventually died. It's fascinating to see the tree. When his brother showed me, oh, this is the tree this guy fell from. It felt so real.
Yeah, the magical.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So
the magical and the real.
The magical and the real and the intertwining of the two. Yeah, so when he was a struggling journalist, the story that gave him his big break was called The Story of the Shipwrecked Sailor. And it's based on the true story of a sailor who survived after the ship went down in the sea. And Marquez interviewed this survivor and wrote the story as if it's sort of a novel, but it was a journalistic piece, right? And then eventually they were like, oh, this is so good, it has to be like a standalone piece, and was taken out and published as a booklet. And that was what gave him his first break. Chronicles of a Death Foretold, his short story collection, No One Writes to the Colonel, all the way to his last book, Memories of My Melancholy Hall. Huge influence in the way that I found Marquez to be to me what Kafka was to Marquez. He had been writing stories that weren't very successful at first. And then he felt like this is not exactly the kind of story I wanted to tell. But the problem was that he hadn't seen anyone prior to him telling stories like that. And the moment he discovered Kafka, he's like, "Oh my God, this is perfect. This is beautiful. These are the kind of stories I want to write." And to have someone else do this, and you see that success in the story and how it works on paper, is brilliant. So before I met Marquez through his works, I have been interested in magical realism and the fantastical and all of that. At a point, I was wondering if this is acceptable, if stories like this would be published in the first instance. And then I discovered Ben Okri and Marquez, and I'm like, yes, it works. People have done
Yes,
it.
the light bulb moment, huh?
Exactly. Yeah. So I decided to, develop my own craft from the inspiration of their own works and situate it within my own social cultural context. And that is like super important to me because our cultures and our histories are full of the fantastical and the magical that are shocking, right? That sometimes don't provide factual accounts of events, but they provide very fascinating details about why people did what they did, how they responded to certain situation challenges, and that is what I try to capture with my work.
Thank you very much, Abubakar. So, I mean, for God's sake, the conversation is driving itself. So, I must follow up on my earlier question and merge it with a bit of your answers. This issue of literary generations has become quite a live one in African literature. It's really a question about the burdens of influence and then contestations of power. Well, there's a possibility that there are in fact no generations, and what we have as individual literary lives like yours doing individual literary things that may or may not work. And then, of course, the anxieties that this entails. Okay, so look at it this way. I'm glad you mentioned him. We can trace a line from Kafka to Marquez to you. We can also trace a line from Amos Tutuala to the unfairly forgotten Itzia Ahmed to you. So this question really is, what are your thoughts about authorship, Abubakar? Is it a creative person reinterpreting what is old and merely, or is the author dead? Is something new created each and every time? What is the relationship of the author and his time? What is the relationship of you, Abubakar, and your material? What of your predecessors, those who follow? And then perhaps at the bottom line of this question is this issue of angst over influence, is it performative or is there something actually there? You've seen it all, so I would definitely like to have your take on that.
I don't think there's anything performative about influence. People are influenced by different things. We are the people we are because we have been, by and large, influenced by our the genetics we inherited from our parents, right? And our children would do the same. They would inherit certain aspects of our traits and make of it what they will. It's not a crime to be influenced by people who have come before you. And I don't think there's anything original. You can't like reinvent the wheel. The wheel has been invented already. So what you can do is to improve it and make it work for you. There's some scholars who say, well, there are 8 types of stories in the world, right? Everything, all the stories in the world focus on these 8 main things. And you can't deviate from any of that. You just like modify it and tell it in a different way. I don't know to what extent that is true, but what I know for sure is that there are instances where you see 2 people working in 2 completely different situations, sharing sort of like the same influences. For instance, I remember there was a time, quite a while ago, to be honest, I think this was around 2010, 2011. I'd written a manuscript that I showed to a friend, Carmen McCain, and she read it and she got back to me and she said, do you know E.E. Sule? Have you read his manuscript? And I'm like, no, I don't know E.E. Sule.
No.
I've heard his name. I've heard his name at that point, but I've never met him. So she's like, well, your novels kind of, I just read his manuscript. There are similarities in the themes, right? The stories are very different, obviously, but there are similarities in the themes. And I said, well, okay, that's interesting. And I kept it aside. A short while after that, I showed it to someone else, Ahmed Mewada, who read it. And the first thing he asked me was, have you read E. Sule's manuscript? And I'm like, okay, this is bothersome.
This is uncanny.
Yeah, exactly. 2 people,
It's really
2 people,
uncanny.
and yeah, exactly.
But Abubakar, magical realism, you could have magically realized yourself in his computer and read his manuscript there. We are suspicious.
That is possible.
Okay, yeah, but please continue. I like this story.
Yeah, so basically it's the influence of space, right? We're influenced by the same space. I mean, he went to the University of Jos. We're not in the same year, we're not in the same program. I don't think we actually coincided. I think he left the university just before I came in. So, and a shared history of living in the north and witnessing the things that we all witness in the north and things like that. So that happens. There's the influence of space. You can't deny that. You can't remove yourself from that. Literary influences in style, right? People who reinforce your style. For me, people like Marquez, Okri, and others. And I think every writer is influenced by everything he has ever read. It doesn't matter whether he likes it or hates it. I mean, you could be influenced by a book you hate, by the fact that you hate it and you don't want your book to be like that, right? So, so you move away from that. That is an influence. And the reality is this: no matter what we want to claim that, oh, we're the most original people in the world or whatever, I think that that ship has sailed a long time ago. Your story can be original to a certain extent, but you are always going to be influenced by your environment, by the people you've read, and all of that. And we become great by standing on the shoulders of others. And to deny those people that have preceded us one way or the other is, I think, perhaps hypocritical and self-serving. And yeah, I don't think it's fair to do that. It's perfectly fine to be influenced by people. I have been influenced by people, and other people have found my work influential, and that is good, and that is the way it should be.
Indeed, very well answered. I think you've expressed my sentiments on the matter. So, onto the book itself. Speaking from my dictatorial stool, would you honor us by telling the audience a bit about this story? And then perhaps you'd also take a reading from that story.
Dictatorships have been quashed. The world has moved on to democracy.
So when I'm quashed, write a story about me.
We can't have you come here with impositions of your own and all that. So Mororo's masterpiece. I enjoyed writing that story. To be honest, I did. It was fun, magical. I've always been fascinated by the idea of someone who gets himself in trouble and knows that he's getting himself in trouble and simply can't stop. Um, he can't stop it. He can't resist it. But then at the same time, it's fascinating that in a story like Abba Mororo's, people kind of see the things that they want to see. They want to see that Mororo is a bad person. Maybe some people liked him. A lot of people like him actually. But then the perspective with which people approach this thing, and they're like, oh, this is about a randy man who is like going all over Zango, fathering bastards, and things like that, which is all fascinating, right? But there are two parties involved. There's Mororo, and there are the women who lusted after Mororo. If you look at it on the balance of things, you're like, okay, these things go both way. And I think that was
Absolutely.
what I wanted to point out with that. But I mean, for me, what makes the story special is I think the depth of Mororo's character and his conflict. The fact that he absolutely loves his wife, but doesn't know how to love her. I think that's a problem that's mostly understated. And in the end, after all his shenanigans, after everything, at the peak of his artistic fulfillment, at that moment where he did his masterpiece, he knew that masterpiece belonged to one person and one person only. All right. The circumstances that happened afterwards were instrumental, but he still felt like he made the right choice with that. But then the conflict of I love this person and I'm mistreating this person, which happens a lot in life. And because they love me, they've suffered on my behalf. And I know I've done that. And I sort of don't know how to make it up to them. And that is the conflict that Mororo finds himself in. And I think it's a fascinating conflict that people find themselves in. Okay, so just to oblige you, I'll read Mororo's masterpiece from the beginning. It was inevitable that my father, Abba Mororo, would meet his end at the hands of one of the men whose wives he had been having amorous congresses with. But no one expected that Ladi Balele would be that man, not even my father. Such was Mororo's shock upon realizing what was about to happen when Danladi burst into the room and found him riding his wife Tele that my father said, "Were you? Not for one so ugly." Those, reportedly, were his last words. And true, Tele, even though she took exception to those words, was by all considerations a hideous woman. She had eyes like a child's squiggle in the sand, nostrils like city gates, and teeth like the disintegrating road wheel of an abandoned war tank. All this set in a swarthy, eczema ravaged face. Must have been her breast, no? My brother Shehu asked. Maybe he likes the way they hang on her chest, like yam tubers. He plucked out the toothpick in his mouth and spat on the ground. If Shehu had stayed close to our father, like I had done all those years working as his apprentice, he would have known that Abba Mororo chased butts, and Telle's generous backside that floundered like disturbed waters when she walked would have appealed to him. Regardless, most people were shocked that Mororo, considered in Zango a maven in charming women and fathering bastards, would end up dead over a woman like her, and especially at the hands of a man as meek as her husband in Ladi Balili. The most obvious candidate to bash my father's head was Musa Gangan, husband of the beautiful Sakina, with whom my father had a relationship that even by the scandalometer of Zango was outrageous. It was without regards to Sakina's husband or her two young children, one of which was rumored to be my father's. Of all his lovers, Sakina was the most formidable, the one my mother regarded the most. I was there when she, a moon-kissed angel, smelling of old money and expensive perfume, first turned up at my father's roadside gallery. Even as a 16-year-old at the time, I knew there was something special about that woman, something that made my heart mellow. She seemed as interested in my father's doe eyes and slide frame as she was in the paintings he had displayed. She was keen on the Zango landscape viewed from the hills he had painted. Father had turned down an offer of 15,000 for it the previous day, and after the customer had left, cursed himself for not taking the money. Once Sakina asked for the price and father had said 500,000, my mouth hung open. And when she tilted her head, looked at the painting longingly, and said she would take it, his jaw dropped. I'll make a 50% down payment now, she said. I'll pay you the balance when you drop it off at my office tomorrow. She considered the portraits he had made of celebrities, Shoyinka, Asha, and the president. Perhaps you could paint one of me, she said, looking into his eyes. By all means, my lady, he said, with a slight bow. News of this went round Zango, and soon those who had bought my father's painting for 5,000 felt they were in possession of something of value. They had a Mororo long before the richest family in Zango acquired one. Sakina's father, the oil baron of Zango, made his money transporting oil and other goods with his articulated trucks. His mansion on the hill overlooking Zango like the castle of a feudal lord dominated the landscape my father painted. It was in this house that she lived because her businessman husband was away from Zango most of the year. It was also in this house I went with my father to paint her portrait and was accosted in a very offensive way by the arrogance of their influence. Intimidating chandeliers, some as big as my father's gallery, hanging low off the ceiling, ornate Persian rugs lining the corridors, a particularly outstanding gold framed mirror that dominated an entire anteroom all by itself. Giant flower vases with intricate designs and expensive looks about them, manning the corners of the hall. All of this reminded me of my status in life, that of a 19-year-old son and apprentice of a locally famous, mostly broke painter and philanderer. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very, very much. You see, I really love that story. So it's inevitable that I'd like to take you up on the issue of women. The women in
Mhm.
your stories are fully rounded. We see them as forces of nature. They are often earnest, they are often capricious, often vindictive, always human, always striving, sometimes failing. Often than not, they are dangerous to the plot structures that they always subvert. I mean, Ina destroys Mororo in much the same way. I'm sure you'd remember Sadia from the Whispering Trees when she sets her grabbing in laws and herself afire in the story Closure from your first
Mm.
collection. Another favorite character is Kekiawa from Wellwind from your previous collection, who is a woman not to forget, or even from this book, Maimuna Dajjaj. So you seem to have a way with women, Abubakar. Could you tell us more about women? Just as importantly, yeah. Before you get to that, just as importantly, could you tell us a bit about the most beloved of your female characters and what made them so relatable?
My female characters are they're female characters. They're characters that happen to be female. And every character, regardless of their gender, have their complexities and all of that. And for me, what fascinates me about writing female characters is the fact that even in instances where people think that they lack agency, where they look completely helpless, like Sadia that you mentioned, right? Where everything seems to be against them, the society and all of that, they have a way of subverting that imposition that is being made on them. In other cases, they aspire, sometimes they comply, and sometimes they are broken by the system that either they are fighting or that has been dictating their lives. And for me, it's important that we acknowledge the fact that these things happen. They go either way, right? There are women who overcome all these situations and challenges and succeed, and there are women who fail, just as there are men who succeed and men who fail as well. And for me, it's always interesting to give my female characters agency. I think that is super important. People ask me, well, how are they so relatable? They are relatable because they are true to themselves in whatever way that they can. I don't think they hold any pretenses, at least not in my thinking. If they are weak because they are humans and vulnerable. And if they are strong, it's because they are strong and maybe confident, maybe not confident sometimes. But they are set in their ways and they are determined to succeed either way. And I think that's the mistake that people make, that there should be one type of female character. And I've seen this in recent Hollywood productions, right? Where you have an ideal now of a strong female character, which doesn't make sense. And I think even a lot of women don't relate to those characters because they feel like, uh, this woman is like has superpowers because she's a woman. Simply being a woman sort of gives her some kind of superpowers that she can do things better than people who have been doing it for thousands of years before. With practice and training and all of that. That's for me is an unrealistic depiction, which is why for me it's important that my female characters have the weakness and the tenderness that is characteristics of their gender, and then have the strength and resilience that is also characteristic of their gender. Because when you look at what women go through in life, the obstacles that society set against them from their birth, right? The physical pain that they have to go through growing up, nurturing children, nurturing families, and all of that. And then they end up being as resilient, as strong as they are. Basically, what I simply do is like imagine if a man goes through all of this thing that women go through. Someone dictates to you how you live, how you marry, who you marry, when you do that, and then the physical pain of birthing, for instance, right? I imagine if people go through every day, go through that, men, what would their lives be like? So it's sort of a reflection, I think, to the best of my ability to capture all of these things, and the fact that all of these challenges do not stop women from being the excellent people that they are when they're excellent, and from being the dubious and evil people that they are when they're dubious and evil, just like men. So yeah, that's why you have a range of different female characters, from the subtle to the vivacious and foxy, to the meek and the humble, and to the brash and scandalous, if you like. I have a very special relationship with all my characters, not just the female, even the male as well, contrary to what you're trying to imply. Uh, which of these female characters has been the most fascinating? To be honest, I don't think it would be fair to say one is more special than the other, because like I really enjoy writing them all. I mean, I absolutely loved writing Kekyawa. She's wild and crazy and fun, and she just doesn't give shit about anything. And I enjoyed writing Binta as well, because she gives shit about everything, right? And then she still lives. So you can see that they're polar opposites of each other. But it's, for me, it's that her grace, her poise, her elegance, right? Even in her fall, and I say fall in quotes, right? There's a certain grace and elegance to it. And it's the calmness and assurance that she brings to the situation that fascinates me. So yeah, absolutely. I enjoyed writing all of the female characters. So probably those are some of the most fascinating, but every single woman I've written has been a delight and a pleasure.
Well, I think you've spoken brilliantly like a good polygamist. So thank you very much for that answer. Thank you very much for that answer. The trick of identifying characteristics of several, it did not pass us. We noticed it, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it's good that you notice it, because like I said, there are complexities to people, and we have to acknowledge each of those complexities.
Absolutely.
And I think sometimes the mistake we make as writers is to assume that because a character is meek, that character should remain meek all through the story. But that is not the reality. In reality, there are people who are meek and timid, but there are instances where they shed that toga of being meek and timid. And so circumstances change the way we interact and react to different stimulations, and we should acknowledge that fairly.
Absolutely correct. I have nothing to add there. We have to be able to embrace complexity in people, in histories, narratives, and all of that. Considering that this festival is full of young writers, I'd like to move on quickly to the issue of publishing. The landscape of publishing in Nigeria is a very, very complicated one. There are not enough publishers, and the ones that try, those independent publishers who don't publish just textbooks, are not selling enough copies to make publishing anything other than a labor of love. But there are so many fine talents and publishers who have been doing their very, very best in very trying circumstances. How has your publishing journey been? The BBC published the Bullman story, then Masobe, Parisia, we published you for a while. Then there was the issue of agents and foreign publishers. So from your experience, could you share a guide to a young writer who wishes to navigate this landscape? Particularly, what did you do right? What came entirely by chance? Being in the right place. And then I think just as important to this question is what do you wish you had done differently?
To be honest, the publishing landscape, not just in Nigeria, but globally, is a very complicated field to navigate. It's so complicated that people need agents to navigate it for them while they busy themselves writing. That is the point of having agents, because writers are people who write, right? So that's what they do. The navigation of complex fields like that are, in most cases, best left to other people who are more competent in that field. In Nigeria, it's particularly complex because there's so few publishers, there's so many writers, so many young writers aspiring to get published, not enough funding, and the business model is still being developed, it's still being worked on. So it's complex and challenging. I think essentially for a writer, I think it's significant to write. I've always maintained this. You are a writer because you write. And I think I was lucky in that sense that I was writing without the pressure of wanting to be published, like maybe with as much fervor as I've seen other young writers aspiring to have. I wrote without that pressure, and I think I was fine with just writing and putting stuff away in my box and all of that until the BBC Prize and the dramatization of a Bullman story. And I think that's the important thing, to have works that are ready to go when the opportunity presents themselves. I think that's a significant thing. Write, develop your craft, perfect the craft. And when the opportunity comes, you have something to present. And I see a lot of young writers who say, oh, I'm thinking of writing a novel or a story or this or that. I don't know where to publish it. And I'm like, well, maybe write the story first, perfect it, clean it up, and then you see about publication. When the opportunity presents itself, you have something to present. And that was what happened. After the Bullman story was published, The Whispering Trees had been written. A friend of mine who had read it back then contacted me and said, what have you done with this story? I'm like, oh, it's still there. And I said, do something about it. And I sent it to African Writer Online, and they published it, and that was it. So now I think younger writers now have even greater opportunities than we had when we were their age. I'm speaking as if I'm that old.
Senior citizen.
But the reality is that now you have these online publishing platforms, right, where you can put your work out there and people can discover them, and which is where Parisia discovered some of my works and decided to start publishing with my book. And I think people should young writers especially, should take advantage of all these platforms, get your works published on these online platforms if they are ready to be published. People have asked several times, they're like, oh, can you connect me with this and that? And I'm like, why are young writers asking for introduction or connection to people when you have the internet, right? You have the internet, you can Google all these agents, Google their emails, see what they like, what kind of submissions they're interested in, and submit to them. With regards to the Nigerian publications, and it's very complicated. I can totally sympathize with that. And sometimes these introductions are necessary, and they've been done where it's needed, because it's not something that you can maybe submit to an agent that will submit to local publishers. It's a situation where you have 5-6 publishing houses and they have periodic calls for submissions, and then they are so overwhelmed with the number of submissions that they get that they can't respond to everybody. And writers who have put in all their efforts in this things feel like, I've written to these people, I've sent them my manuscript, I haven't got a response. It hurts. I know it does. It's painful, but that's the situation that we find ourselves in. And I think it's really hard, it's challenging, but people should keep writing and keep believing and keep submitting and get that international profile or get published online, build that reputation, and wait for the opportunities.
So we have had a long and lovely conversation, and I worry that I may have spoken Too much because I'm a kind person. All right, so I'll give you the final cookie. In the way of final words, what would you like to say about anything at all? Could be Nigeria, literature, politics, absolutely anything by way of final words.
Let's not talk about Nigeria. In the final analysis, I think I should just say to people that life is beautiful, even when it looks ugly and stressful and difficult and tough. If you take a moment to breathe, to reflect, you'll find something beautiful to appreciate in life. And I know people are going through a lot. I just want to say that, and which is what we do as writers, is that we take all this bitterness and the pain and all of it and try to make sense of it in a way that is kind of beautiful and that we can engage with without necessarily being depressed. So yeah, life is beautiful. Live it. As someone said, smell the flowers, look at the butterflies, take a minute to do that. And I think we should be kind to each other, even in the smallest ways. As you see, a lot of people being frustrated with life and all of that. I don't know what the next person is going through. And sometimes we can be like super insensitive and super callous. And we just see things off the cuff of our head because we are dealing with our own frustrations. And it's terrible. So to be honest, I think we should be kind to each other. That's my main message. Say something nice to the person that you see down the road, the person that you know is struggling with some issues or something, and enjoy life.
Thank you very much for taking my questions, and the lovely people at Kabafest who have been on the technical end of this, doing an amazing job. So thank you very much, Abubakar.
Thank you, Richard. It's lovely speaking to you always.
Dreams and Assorted Nightmare, and you remember I finished reading it sort of in the middle of the night and found myself sending you notes about it. And the reason why I loved the book so much is the completeness of the characters that you built, and I think I shared that with you. You captured what I call northern characters in their full humanity. And given what is going on in Nigeria now, increasingly, especially in the mainstream media, there's a caricature of the North that goes on, whether it is northern women being put in a box. And so it sort of just was really, I think the word is beautiful, to actually read stories that captured our full essence, that represented us, the good, the bad, and the ugly of all of us. And I remember laughing, crying, tearing up, all the emotions. But then, when you were talking earlier with Richard, you said that you do not set out with any sort of message when you're writing. And I'm wondering, is that really true? If I sort of look at the impact of your work in the way you project us, that hasn't been really done in recent times. Are you not aware at all that this is what you're doing, fully humanizing us?
That's a brilliant question from a brilliant journalist and a brilliant person.
Yeah, so let's have your take on that.
I think basically it's with individual stories. Most times I don't really set out with an agenda. I think there's an overarching philosophy behind my writing, which kind of domiciles it in a particular location, which is the location that I happen to know, which is the location that we are in, the north of Nigeria, right? And it has its peculiarity and culture. So definitely that is going to influence the kind of stories I tell and how I tell those stories. But most times when I start out to write individual pieces, most of the time there isn't like this agenda that, oh, I want to write about FGM, about poverty in the north, about things like that. I just want to write about the people who live in these places, right? And they happen to sometimes be poor, they happen to be sometimes rich, they happen to be different types of people. And I think what's the worst thing any creative can do in writing about a place is trying to write about it in a perfect way. And I see this being done a lot with women in literature and in film as well, where there's this pressure to portray women as super perfect and they just come on board and like start doing things that are not feasible. The reality is that women, like men, like people in the north, like people everywhere, are good at other things. They have flaws at other things. They are fantastic humans in some places, and in some places they're just nasty people, you know. And that is the reality of life. And trying to reflect that is what I try to do. I don't sugarcoat anything, and I don't pretend that there are no flaws in the North, in the cultural system that has shaped the North and its people, you know. So,
Okay, thank you
okay,
very much, Abubakar. And we understand
yeah.
you had to leave class in order to grace us with your presence. So, all the best, and thank you very much from all of us at Kabafest. Could we give him a hoorah?